I am still getting used to that awesome pump up music by Joe, so thank you for that awesome new intro. Dancing, good way to wake up in the morning. Good morning, everybody. Speaking of which, my name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I think most of you have joined us before today, but if we've got some new teachers coming in for the first time, then we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Now, May was our most epic month of all time. If you got the chance to join us, we did both our Global Biodiversity Festival, the largest conservation program in history with 72 straight hours of broadcasting, and of course, we are just wrapping up our Backyard Bio Global Nature campaign. Almost 40,000 observations on iNaturalist, tons of engagement on social media, and teachers around the world connecting with one another to share their love of nature. It's been such a special month. And so we could have taken a break in June. We could have relaxed, but we chose not to. We wanted to dive in with a bang and highlight Happy Pride Month, everybody. So in my hometown of Toronto, my original hometown, it is one of the biggest festivals of the year. I know we can't really gather in person quite the way that we want to this year, but we wanted to do something really special and highlight today with 3 back-to-back-to-back programs featuring fantastic LGBTQ speakers talking about some of the really top-notch and most amazing research topics in the world and things that our classes are so interested nowadays. And so last hour, we wrapped up with Hugh Griffiths from the British Antarctic Survey. He talked with us about his amazing work at the bottom of the world, featuring some of the most unique and incredible biodiversity there. And we are continuing that train, but we are going from the bottom of the world all the way to the top of the world into the Arctic with Paul Sokoloff. So for people who have joined us before for one of his programs, he is of the Canadian Museum of Nature, one of the iconic research institutions in Canada. They've got some of the most amazing stuff if you ever get the chance to go to Ottawa in person. And we are joining with them on their Nature Ideas series as well right now. So we've done a bunch of broadcasts with them over the last few weeks. If you get the chance, check that out on our YouTube channel. Now, Paul is an Arctic botanist, and he gets to go up to some of the most remote and fantastic regions of Canada to explore the wonderful world of plants up there, which a lot of us might not know that much about. And so I'm not going to steal his thunder. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Thank you so much for joining us again, and take us away.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. It's always a pleasure to be here. And thank you for that introduction. It's nice to be able to talk about the Antarctic and then move to the Arctic as well.
We've almost never done this in our history, so this is kind of a special thing. I'm really excited for kids that are
going from pole to pole. It's so good. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to put this up. There we go. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the work that I do along with my colleagues at the Museum of Nature, which is all about the biodiversity of Inuit Nunavut, the Inuit homeland in Canada. And we focus a lot on plants and lichens. We sometimes work on mosses and seaweeds. And of course, I have colleagues who work on mammals, who work on fossils, who work on minerals, all on this really interesting place in Canada. So, the first thing I'd like to do is actually highlight some of those people. When we talk about science, there's often been the kind of this vision that science is these people who are working in labs, hunched over, making discoveries and yelling "Eureka!" I've been in the lab by myself plenty of times late at night trying to get some data. But the best science is done together. It is done with colleagues and with friends and with partners and with people who live on the land. So I like to highlight essentially what makes the science for me all worthwhile, which is the amazing to work, the ability to work with these amazing people. And so, all of the work that I'm showing you is not just stuff I do, it's stuff that all of these fine folks are doing as well. So we're talking about the poles, and you probably, if you heard from Hugh just last hour, you probably already have a vision of this in your head. And for lots of folks, this is essentially what they think of when they think of the Arctic. They think of snow, they think of ice. They might think of a boat of students or tourists passing through quietly past some icebergs. And, the Arctic does have lots of snow and ice. It's an important part of the Arctic ecosystem. However, that's not all the Arctic is. The Arctic is this vast array of landscapes and habitats and different kind of landforms all across northern Canada and around the world in the circumpolar Arctic. And all of these different habitats, these microenvironments, things like glacial river valleys on Baffin Island in the top left, or Somerset Island, which is a lot of limestone and gravel, or the low Arctic with big shrubs, or the flat plains of Victoria Island. all host different types of biodiversity. And so as a botanist who's interested in the Arctic, I'm interested in seeing all of these different types of habitats. So the Arctic is all of this. And, it's huge. In Canada, the Arctic is 40% of Canada's landmass. That's everything here that you see here in green. Now, this is just one way of defining the Arctic. This is the tree line. So everything that you see in green here is above the tree line. You can also define the Arctic as the Northern Territories. You can define the Arctic as everything above the Arctic Circle, where you have this midnight sun. You can also define the Arctic as temperature, the 10-degree July isotherm, where on average in July the temperature is 10 degrees. These are all different ways of looking at the Arctic, but the Arctic is firstly and foremostly Inuit homeland. So I used the word Inuit Nunavut at the very beginning of my talk. Inuit Nunavut is the Inuit homeland in Canada. And here that is composed of 4 distinct regions: Nunatsiavut, Nunavik, the territory of Nunavut, and the Inuvialuit settlement region. The Arctic has been home to Inuit for thousands of years. So every time we're going, we are working in someone's backyard. And it's really important for us to make sure that we're working in a respectful manner, but that we're also working with communities to make sure that communities are empowered by the knowledge that we're working on, and also that we listen respectfully to knowledge that we are getting from the communities as well when we're there. All right. So I've told you a little bit about what the Arctic is. Now I'll tell you what a botanist is. Now, a botanist does not arrange flowers in a flower shop for a living. That's a florist. However, perfectly valid career option. She's having a great time. I typically only arrange flowers after about 3 weeks in the field, and I'll put them on my head. Sometimes I'll prance around and proclaim myself the king of legumes. For reasons that I'll get into slightly. This is called field brain. This happens all the time. I'm certain this happens in Antarctica too. But yeah, this is typically not what I do for a living. No, what I'm really interested in is I'm interested in sorting biodiversity. And this is one system for sorting biodiversity. This is Linnaean taxonomy. If you've ever looked at a scientific name of a plant or an animal or a fossil, you see it's kind of got this double-barreled name with a genus and a species. And so the work that we are doing at the museum is essentially sorting out plant biodiversity in the Arctic into these categories. And there's a reason for that. By sorting things out, we can talk and compare biodiversity, not only by looking at numbers of species in different areas, but also by assigning them Latin names. We can easily talk about them with other scientists. And so that's, we can say, instead of saying, oh, it's the yellow flower, I can give it a Latin name, and then somebody will know immediately what that species is. So this is one way of looking at plants. This is the morphological species concept. And so all of these flowers that you see here are in the plant family Fabaceae. This is the bean and the pea family. And, I think lots of people are familiar with this because we use legumes a lot in our everyday life. And so people might actually, you might have a good idea of what pea flowers look like. But even if you don't, I hope that you're looking at this and inspired by how beautiful they are. And I mentioned Prince of Legumes earlier. I did my master's thesis on one of these genera here, actually. So they're fun. They're close to my heart. All right, so by putting these up, if you look at these, you can see, oh wait, they all kind of go together. They're similar in some ways. They all have roughly the same flower shape. They all have markings on the interior parts of the petals, but there are differences as well. There are different flower colors, there are different flower sizes. Some of them look slightly different. So they all go together, but they're all different at the same time. So this is the family level. We can further refine that and say, okay, well, all of these things in this genus, that's the first part of that Latin name, are all more closely related to each other, both in appearance, but also genetically, than everything else in the family. And so we've kind of narrowed it down more. And we as scientists, one of our hypotheses is that anytime we're saying we're refining this, is there's a single common ancestor somewhere back in evolutionary time that has led to this group. And so all of these members of the genus Astragalus all have one common ancestor within that Fabaceae family. And then we can go even further and refine it down to the level of species. And then we have Astragalus bodinii, Boden's milkvetch, which grows all across Northwest Territories. And this particular species, if I look at this, across most of its range, it should all look the same, and it should be genetically similar across its range. And all of these species, everything that we are assigning to the species, are all more closely related to each other than anything else in that genus. And that's that Latin name. That's essentially our hypothesis, that everything in this group are one species. And then by giving it that name, it helps us in conservation and in quantifying biodiversity and in figuring out what grows where. Now, that's Linnaean taxonomy, but that's not the only way of looking at plants. This is a bog willow, Salix fuscescens. In Arviat, an elder might call it ukpik, which is the Arviat term for that particular plant. If we're talking English and French common names, bog willow and saule fauve are different ways of talking about plants. And, Latin names are great, but they're not the only way of looking at biodiversity. And so it's important for us to remember that, people relate to plants in many different ways, and that's great. And one of the nicest things about working at a museum is plants are an integral part of people's lives, and we get to consider that when we're doing our research. All right, so looking across the Canadian Arctic anyway, we think there are about 1,000 different vascular plant species. Now, what's a vascular plant? Well, if you look outside, if you have a window, or if you have a house plant, if it has a stem, and if it has roots and it has leaves, that's a vascular plant. And it's actually got bundles of tissue inside the stem that transport transport water and nutrients throughout the plants. And those are vascular plants. Those are what we think of when we look at vascular plants. Things like the purple mountain saxifrage you see in the top right corner are vascular plants, and the Arctic willow, which is in the bottom right, are vascular plants. And in the Arctic, they have adaptations which allow them to survive during the harsh Arctic winters, but also during the Arctic summers when they come alive and they bloom. And so, a lot of them are very low to the ground where they grow prostrate. And this is because the ground gets warmer in the sun, and the plants like to soak up that heat. There's also, on the Arctic willow, you can see it's quite fluffy and hairy. Well, just like us, having those hairs help insulate it against Arctic winds and against chill, which might interfere with the plant's ability to develop. So it well adapted to its environment. Now, those aren't the only things that grow in the Arctic. There's seaweeds, there are lichens, there are mosses, there's all sorts of Arctic biodiversity that we term flora that we're interested in studying. And I mentioned we think there are about 1,000 different plant species. And how do we know that? Well, we can go up and we can, do inventories, but we also collect. And by collecting plants and by essentially squashing them in between pieces of cardboard, we can bring them back to a herbarium that's at the museum. We call it the National Herbarium of Canada, which is a library of over 1 million pressed and dried plant specimens. By keeping these things all in one place and by digitizing them and serving images of these plants to anyone with an internet connection, we're better able to sort. And to, by having it all in place, we can easily say, okay, well, all of these things go together here. All of these things go together here. By being able to refer to the collection and make the collection accessible to anybody, we're able to figure out exactly what plants grow where across the Canadian Arctic. Now, of course, building the collection means you get to do field and lab-based research to get there. You answer these questions about biodiversity by essentially going out and figuring what's on the land. And that's where our team at the museum, that's what we specialize in. We're interested in finding biodiversity where it grows. So what we typically do in a normal field season is we'll pack up all of our gear. We'll get on a plane like this. This is a plane chartered by the Polar Continental Shelf Program, which supports a lot of our research. Yes, it is as old as it looks, but it flies like a dream. And very, very cool experience to travel in a plane like this. Sometimes we'll travel low tech. We'll actually do some whitewater rafting. This is on the Sopa River on southern Baffin Island near the community of Kimmerit. And, it's a little low tech, but certainly a lot of fun to travel around and do that. And we'll spend about a month living and camping on the land and collecting individuals of all the species that we see, so that those vouchers, those pressed plants that we bring back to the herbarium, can be that particular proof that what we found this particular plant growing at this place at this time. So like I said, we walk out on the tundra. We'll typically spend like a day walking on the tundra very slowly because we're looking for plants the entire time. And we'll bring them back to our field camp, and we'll press them in a plant press just like this. So, you know, state of the art, it's circa the 1800s. And once it's squashed and two-dimensional, the plants last for thousands of years. In fact, some of our oldest known pressed plants come from Egypt. They come from the tombs of some of the pharaohs. So we know that they'll last a long time as long as we keep them in the proper conditions. And we typically collect quite a bit. In fact, this is, I think, maybe 2 days worth of collecting for Roger, Jeff, and myself when we were in the community of Kugluktuk back in 2014. And so we typically, you know, we try to make sure that we get specimens that we can use to identify these plants. So the museum has been doing Arctic research for over 100 years. We actually grew out of the Geological Survey of Canada. But in our recent, sort of the last 12 years, we've had an Arctic research program that has brought us specimens from across Nunavut and across the Northwest Territories. And all of these places are places that our team has documented the flora so that we can better understand what's there now and look at how these plants might change in the coming years. By having that baseline, we'll be able to better say, okay, well, how are things changing? Because we have this definitive series of what happened in the past. So our team, you know, it goes up and has the immense privilege of working in Inuit Nunavut, finding these really interesting plants and turning them into these two-dimensional specimens, which will help us and researchers from across Canada and around the world figure out what plants grow where in the Canadian Arctic, and how can we better tell how things are changing in the future. Of course, as we are working in Nunavut, it's very important to remember that as we are watching the plants, we are often being watched by wildlife. So things like Arctic hares, Arctic foxes, the occasional very curious Arctic wolf. So with all that, I'd like to say thank you so much for being here today. And also, you know, Jesse mentioned the Pride Progress flag that Hugh posted at the beginning of last presentation. And so I actually wanted to finish off with a Pride Progress flag made up of Arctic flora. And to talk about this a little bit, you know, it's been a really immense privilege to be able to be an openly queer man working in science. And it's important for me to take those feelings of acceptance and also make sure that, you know, Pride has to be a fight for something better. It has to be a fight for inclusion. It has to be a fight for reconciliation, and it has to be a fight for social justice. So all of the science that we do happens with people, and by making science inclusive and by making our communities inclusive and just, we're doing better science and we're living better lives. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have lots of questions.
Paul, I'm sure we do. I want to actually while we've got this slide up for a minute. You mentioned Pride Progress flag. It's beautiful, by the way. So Hughes, which is in the background of the whole thing right now, is made up of Antarctic wildlife. So the eye of the penguins in the black part. You've got these beautiful, beautiful plants. What does you highlighted broadly what the Progress flag represents, and I think a lot of us might know the rainbow flag as the rainbow flag. We'll see it at pride parades and around shops and around, you know, society in general throughout the month of June. What do the additional, I guess, diagonal bits coming in represent?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. So as you mentioned, you know, the original Pride flag was made up of these 6 colors that each of them actually has a different meaning. But recently we've discovered that it's not enough to simply talk about queer inclusion unless we are being purposely intersectional in that. And so the Pride Progress flag, these colors represent trans and BIPOC individuals who are members of the queer community. And it's really important to remember that, you know, it's all of us together. And so we explicitly have to fight for our trans cousins, our Black and brown and members of the queer community. We're all in this together, and that's what the Pride Progress flag means.
Fantastic. I'm really glad we got that message, and I wanted to make sure we highlighted that. If you want to come out of screen share now, have a bit of a conversation with us. We're going to dive in. I think, one of the benefits of these programs and what we saw with Hugh's program is that people, certainly in the chat, were keen to not just talk about the research, but talk about maybe their own experiences in STEM, maybe talk about, how this is an inspiring thing to hear from people who can speak to the importance of representation and diversity in science and exploration. I think that that's something that we really try and focus on at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, both through programs like this. This is a one-day thing. This is great. I'm having a ton of fun, and I think our classes are really loving it. But the work goes beyond June 1st, and it goes beyond all of June, and it's something where I think increasingly kids of all stripes are seeing themselves in these explorers. Hugh mentioned that when you looked at Antarctic old photos, it's always like, a bunch of bearded white men, and they're out in the plains, and half of them died in their expedition. And I mean, that is one version of exploration. It's very, very cool. Don't get me wrong. But it's really important to highlight as many diverse stories as you can, because I think it leads to more positive action in general around the world. So I thank you so much for your story today. This was so nice. And I want to dive in with questions. I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, we might be getting a class joining in India. Well, they did join our SDG, Sustainable Development Goal Warriors, with Ms. Preet's class. So welcome into you guys. And I want to dive in with questions. So if anyone is in the chat bar, they want to let me know where they're joining from, share questions there, great. But I'm going to start us off with Miss Dickinson joining us for just your second broadcast. They're grade 5s in Bradley, in Illinois. If you want to kick us off with a question, Miss Dickinson, take us away.
Yes, I have Lewis in my 5th grade class would like to know what inspired you to research botany in the Arctic?
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. It's actually 2 separate answers. I always loved being around plants. When I was growing up, my family had a garden, and I was encouraged to get in there, and we would go to a garden center, and they'd be like, "Okay, what kind of flowers do you want to bring?" And I think from that young age, I always wanted to work with plants, and actually I took a bit of a path around that. I eventually went to school for journalism. I wanted to be a science writer, and I would walk past the greenhouses, the biology part of the campus every day, and be like, "Oh, I really want to know what's in there." And that was enough of a signal for me to be like, "Oh, maybe that's actually what I want to do more." So that's it. How did I get involved in the Arctic? Well, when I was at the museum, I actually did my master's thesis on at the Canadian Museum of Nature, focusing actually on plants that grew in Labrador. And actually, I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador originally. I was born in St. John's, so that was interesting to me. But what happened was, after I finished my thesis, they said, we have a job if you're interested in working in the Arctic. And I said, yes, I'm absolutely interested in doing that. And that was 11 years ago, and I really, it's been a ride ever since.
I always love that you get that question every time, and I love your answer every time. It's so much fun for me. I forget every time that you're a Newfoundlander. It's like, so I'm going to stress something. This is completely unrelated to the broadcast. For everyone in Canada, if you're going to travel one place in your life, go to Newfoundland. Everyone goes to Alberta. It's great. I love Alberta. I love British Columbia. My favorite place I've ever been in this country, and arguably in the planet, is Newfoundland. Both St. John's and the West Coast, just such a special and unique place, and a really unique place to see some really cool botany as well. So no wonder you got inspired from some of the really unique ecosystems out there. So
absolutely.
Ms. Dickinson, for that great question. Ms. Lynch's family, there you go, and our live today is also from there. So awesome. We've got Newfoundlanders galore. Miss Preet, so I want to head to our SGG Warriors joining us in the evening all the way in India. If you want to unmute your microphone and share a question on behalf of your kids, welcome in.
Okay, so I've got many questions. One of them is, Arctic plants have got colorful flowers, so they would be pollinated by insects like bees and butterflies. How do these animals survive in the Arctic region?
Great question.
Super great question. Yeah, so lots of bees. In fact, Arctic bumblebees can be pretty big, for as big as a bee gets. And so a lot of them also have adaptations to living. So Arctic bees are super fluffy. Arctic butterflies tend to be pretty small, so they're not losing a lot of heat through body mass. But my favorite Arctic pollinator is the mosquito. Some Arctic plants are mosquito pollinated, and there are lots of mosquitoes in Nunavut, Northwest Territories. And so a lot of them are actually, my favorite one is a little orchid. It's called the Northern Bog Orchid, and it's green, so it's not super showy. But mosquitoes apparently will go on and pollinate it. And then lots of Arctic plants, they might have super colorful flowers, but they're also adapted to self-pollination. Some of my favorite, they're called pedicularis. Some of them, they have this petal that kind of closes and keeps pollen in, and so it's actually better adapted to self-pollination. So these pollinators that do exist there, they have similar but sometimes different adaptations. But sometimes the plants just don't need pollinators.
What a very thoughtful question. Thanks, Ms. Preetz Group. That was awesome. You mentioned mosquitoes. So this is one of my biggest consciousness shifts in my life. Is I always assumed mosquitoes were warm temperature things, and then I saw what summer in the Arctic can look like. And it's actually I think the Yukon does have the most mosquitoes per area of anywhere on the planet when it's really heavy duty time. We've had explorers on talk about the fact they open their mouths and 100 mosquitoes can be hoovered in if you're not wearing some sort of face protective gear. It's horrible. It's just, I feel for you, Paul.
Really? Part of it.
Yeah, of course, 10,000 bites. That's all in the day's work. I need to stress something too before I forget to add this. So you talked about your inspiration as a boy about plants. When I was a kid, I was really obsessed with David Attenborough. And there's a series called The Private Life of Plants, which is amazing, but is almost impossible to find. I had to track it down in Britain. So in 2022, the BBC is releasing The Green Planet, which for any of you who've seen Planet Earth, Blue Planet, they're going to do one entirely on plants, and it's going to be amazing. And so I really encourage you guys to check that out if you get the chance next year. Very exciting stuff. All right, Ms. Sokol's class, they're joining us, senior kindergartners in Toronto. Just unmute your mic and come on in. Hey, guys.
So I haven't really been able to connect with our students. I did see a question from another class asking if there are any polar bears where you do your research, Paul.
There are, and this is always something that we take a lot of precautions when we're out on the land to make sure that we don't run into bears. So, for instance, we'll have when we're camping, we'll make sure that all of our food and personal care supplies are in the food tent, which is 100 meters away from where we actually tend to sleep. We'll have a bear fence sometimes. And also, part of it is talking to people. So if we're passing through a community, talking about, are there bears around? Have you heard, is it a berry kind of year? And so by staying informed, that better helps us avoid those interactions. And actually, we've been, knock on wood, we've never had something in camp. We take a lot of care when we're out on the land. And I've seen bears from the deck of a ship, which is the perfect place to see them.
We've talked a lot in these broadcasts about the importance of building up relationships with communities. And this is a weird thought, but my first thought was when you say, hey, is this a berry kind of community? And they're like, no, yes, no bears at all. This is where it's really important to have those relationships and connections with people wherever you go. And I think you highlighted that so nicely at the beginning of the program, how important it is, especially in Indigenous territory in Canada, which there's so much in our northern territories, and Nunavut and beyond. So yeah, great question, guys. Miss Lynch's class, I'm going to head to you guys next. They're joining us, grade 5-6s in Erin, Ontario. Come on in and go for it.
Hi. So a lot of my students are wondering this common theme of how do plants grow and what the temperatures are like, because here we are in Ontario, it's 20 degrees right now, and they're just so shocked that these beautiful plants can grow in these different weather conditions.
It's a fantastic question, and it's all about adaptation. In fact, I think I talked about Arctic willows and how they grow kind of flat to the ground and they're covered in hairs to insulate them. And actually, willows are something that we think of as big weepy things that grow by lakes here. And so within that group, there's all of this different genetic potential for adaptation that's happened through evolutionary time to get it kind of perfectly sorted for its Arctic environment. And so, things like those hairs that insulate them, plants that grow close to the ground absorb a lot more heat from the sun because the sun is heating up the ground. A lot of them have a small surface area. They grow as cushions so that, relative to the outside, they're not losing lots of heat just by being exposed to the environment. And one of my favorite adaptations is in Arctic poppies, which actually, they have these big radar-like petal flowers that track the sun and actually move with the sun thanks to hormones sending different signals throughout the stem. and that keeps the flower warm, which helps the developing seeds stay at the proper temperature. So, all of these different evolutionary adaptations have led to this massive flora that is perfectly suited for its environment.
We go. Click the wrong button. Sorry about that. Fantastic, guys. This is great. We did it. Paul, we're whipping through these. These presentations have been so short, which makes it so much easier to have a really great Q&A. We've got time for a whole other round of questions. If you are on YouTube and you don't want to be shy, go for it. But let's head back to Ms. Dickinson's class. If you guys have another question for us, just unmute your mic and you're good to go.
All right. Landon was asking, what does the word polar mean and what makes it a polar climate?
Oh, okay. So polar refers to the pole and the North Pole in the case of where I work. And so, we think of the Earth as having these axes, the North and South Pole. That's what it is. And essentially, the polar climate comes from the fact that it is at the northern tip, or if you're talking about the Antarctic, the southern tip of the planet. And because of extreme variations in how it tilts, and because it's not getting as much solar radiation as places along the equator, that's what's giving it that climate, that chill, and also the midnight sun I referred to. So in the summer, as the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, you're actually getting the sun kind of circling around at the higher Arctic latitudes, because the sun, the Earth isn't tilting back to have the sunset.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's one of my favorite things when we talk about Arctic and Antarctic sort of research and expeditions. We had Alex Anaviapek. She joined us live in Pond Inlet a few months ago. She was awesome, and she talked about the reverse of this. So summer, you get the midnight sun, constant sun, and in the depths of winter, you get perpetual darkness for months on end. And so the celebration that the community has when the sun crests the horizon for the first time is just so special. And I love stories like this about the world's such a different place. I think actually Ms. Preet's class joining us, which we'll go to next for a question, having been near the equator in my life, it's so fantastic when you get to go there and see how quick night comes. So it's day, and then night comes and it's darkness when you're close to the equator. Whereas here in Canada, northern Canada, Ontario, we're used to this long twilight hours of like slight diffuse light in the air. That isn't the case in a lot of parts of the world. And so thinking about those sort of things, I think, is a really special opportunity to highlight the magic of the world. Ms. Preet, back to you guys and your SDG warriors. Come on back in and take us away.
Okay, so this is another question. Given that cultivation would be challenging, did the Inuits traditionally get to eat vegetables? If not, how did they survive on a meat-only diet? Was it healthy?
Absolutely. In fact, country foods continue to be a super important part of Inuit diets in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and in other Inuit regions like Nunatsiavut and Nunavik. And in fact, actually, lots of country foods have a lot of vitamins that you might think of being associated with vegetables like vitamin C and vitamin D. But there are edible Arctic plants too. One of my favorites is mountain sorrel, which is chock full of vitamin C and is super nutritious and tasty. However, I'm not allowed to eat a lot of them because, we do have to press them and collect them. But there are other many Arctic plants that are edible. Some like cotton grass, they're used as wick for oil lamps called the kulik. All sorts of plants have been and are continue to be used by Inuit in many different ways as part of their lives.
One of the things that we learn about as children in Canadian schools, and I expect much more so nowadays with today's youth, is this idea of using everything. That Indigenous and Inuit communities have been living on these lands for thousands and thousands, if not over 10,000 years, and so everything gets used, whether it's parts of an animal or all the plants that you can use. I mean, trial and error, I guess, over a very long period of time gives you a really intense understanding of the living things around you and their uses as food, as tools, as medicine. I think it's such a beautiful cultural tradition, and I think something that, in a fairly wasteful culture in the West, we can really use to adopt as sort of an ethos. So I love that story. I like the idea of you eating all the plants in your thing. Like, oh, Paul's come back from the botany expedition. Where did it go? Who knows? Ms. Sokol's class, you guys had a question in the chat, so I'll come to you live to share. Come on in.
Yeah, thank you. So one of our kindergarten students, Yab, has a question. He asks, why do butterflies smell and eat flowers, in his words?
Oh, that's a good question. And actually, I will preface this by saying I'm not a very good entomologist, so I will to answer to the best of my ability. But essentially, what they're looking for is they're actually looking for nutrition. They're looking for the nectar that's in the flowers, and so they have a proboscis that they put down in the flower to suck up the juicy nectar. And in doing so, this is a kind of a thing that the flower presents, but also, oh, look, it's picked up some pollen and it's going to take it to another plant so that it can create seeds. So that's what the butterflies are looking for. And, I think, yeah, that's my answer.
Answer, I like that. I have two nerdy follow-ups to this. So one thing that's really fascinating is if you look at really, really old plants, like hundreds of million years ago, the first plants, what they did is insects would come and just eat the pollen. And so we have these old lineages of plants where that's still the way that what happens. They spread pollen, but they also eat it. Well, pollen's really expensive to produce. It's like a really rich thing. And so plants sort of hit upon a strategy. They didn't think about it. They evolved it. Where it was like, okay, let's just offer some sugar water instead. It's the easiest bribe in the world. So now the insects come, just get this little tiny bit of sugar water, and then as they're drinking the sugar water, they get dusted with pollen. So the plant is using the insects to fertilize other plants. It's literally using them. And all it gets in return is this little tiny bit of nectar, which is really basically nothing from the plant's perspective, which is really cool. And if you're looking for plants, you'll often, if you guys go in your gardens for our kids in today's broadcast, you'll notice, of course, different flowers are different colors. The color of plants usually reflects the type of insects that pollinate them or the types of things that pollinate them, which is so cool. White plants are often pollinated by things at night because white's easier to see at night and can present that way. So moths, bats. Red plants, insects don't see red as well. So red plants are often bird pollinated, which is really cool. So I think the more you learn about these things, the cooler it comes to be. And so I love that answer, Paul. And
Awesome.
nice to share some more too.
Thank you.
Miss Lynch, if you want to come in and wrap us up, time flies and you're having fun here, people. Come on in, Miss Lynch, and take us away.
So one question my students are wondering is the preparation that you do to explore when you are going exploring in the Arctic, such as what food you prepare, how do you sleep, things like that.
That's a fantastic question, and actually something I'm thinking about right now, because we're trying to figure out, okay, well, how does research look going forward? So the very first thing that we do is that we actually go through a process where we consult with the community, and in many ways we do that by filling out permit applications, and these go to the community so that the community can have a sense of what we're planning on doing, and they can say, okay, well, yeah, that sounds great, or here's some modifications to make to this research plan that really fit with what we see and what we know and where we see research going. And then from there, one of the things that we like to do often is look and see where we haven't been and where maybe people haven't researched plants in a long time. So going back and building a baseline where maybe people haven't been collecting recently. From there, then we have to prepare some food. So we'll dehydrate some meals. We'll bring some ready-made dehydrated meals. We'll also get fishing licenses and fish if we're out camping for a while, which is great. Like, that's an awesome thing. And then we'll buy some food when we're in the communities and grocery stores. And then we'll have tents. And so we each have our own sleeping tent, and we'll have a cooking tent, and we'll have a lab tent. And then making sure that we have all of the gear that we need. So newsprint to press the plants in, all of our plant presses, everything that we need to live for a month on the land, and things like satellite phones so we can check in with our museum on a daily basis so that things go well. So we typically will start getting ready for a field season, we'll start the fall before, just getting ready, working with Polar Shelf to make sure that, maybe they have planes that we can use. So it's a long process, and it is always 100% worth it.
Yeah, I always love that question. It's so important, I think, if people are thinking about expeditions of their own, whether that's as a scientist later in their career, whether it's early on, they want to go on a first big adventure. Prep is the biggest part of it. To make sure that you're safe when you're doing these sorts of things, to make sure you get to achieve what you're trying to do. So much preparation goes into this by such a large team, and I think that's a really important message for our kids today. So thank you, Paul. Guys, we are at the end of the broadcast. Again, time flies and you're having fun. I want to bring up again the nature.ca site. So if you want to check out the amazing work of the Museum of Nature in Ottawa, do check that out. There's so much to learn there. Again, we are in the midst of our Nature Ideas series with them. So many great programs on our YouTube channel if you want to check those out as well. And Paul, before we wrap up today, again, I want to stress it. We've got this big background. We highlighted it in the presentation, but happy Pride Month to everybody. It's been such a fun program series today, and we're wrapping it up with Jackie Saturno in just a few minutes, which is really nice. Is there a last message you want to share with us about your own expeditions, about your own experience in STEM that kids can take home with them today, Paul?
You said it earlier, representation matters, and that's really important. And one of the things that I have learned is that it is really important to be yourself and to be true to yourself when you are picking a career. And that's something that I've found a lot, and I've been really fortunate. And that's also something that is important for all of us to keep in mind when we're interacting with our peers and our friends and our colleagues, is that, we like making room for everybody to be their truest self at work and in their lives is one of the best things that we can do as scientists and as humans. And so thank you for bringing that up, Jesse.
Paul, there's no better message to end on than that. And so as you know, what we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our teachers. So Ms. Sokol, Ms. Lynch, Ms. Dickinson, and Ms. Freed. If you guys want to join me in saying a big thank you